Okay, shall I begin, Lenka? Yeah. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, perhaps. Welcome to the third Mycorrhizal Encounters conversation series. This series is part of the Descendants of Fungi and the Eco-Politics of Sharing festival organised by a community called 𝗍𝗲, which in English translates as Woods, Community for Cultivation, Theory and Art. This conversation series has been organised by myself, 𝗍𝗵𝗶𝗃𝗹 and 𝗍𝗶𝘀. Teresa moderated the first conversation with 𝗘𝗹𝘀𝗽𝗲 and 𝗠𝗆𝗃, after which followed the second event, where Lenka and I were in conversation with 𝗟𝗲𝗀𝗽𝗃. And you can catch up with these conversations on the YouTube page for the Institute of Anxiety. This event will also be recorded, and we want to invite you to pose questions using the box at the bottom of the screen. And we'll bring these into the conversation with us, into the discussion during the second half of the event. So that leaves me to thank you for joining before I hand over to Lenka.
So hello everyone, ahoy. It's my pleasure to introduce Chido Govera, who is a Zimbabwean entrepreneur, mushroom farmer, campaigner and educator, and a founder of the Future of Hope Foundation. Through the foundation, Chido aims to fulfill her commitment to ending poverty, abuse, self-pity and victimhood, and at the grassroots level in Zimbabwe and other places as well, through sustainable food security and with a focus on women, girls and orphans, thus seeking to enable a world where there is a hope and a future for all. So welcome and thank you for accepting our invitation, Chido, to take part in this conversation series. We're really honored. And I would start us off with the first question, which will be a question around the foundation, about the Future of Hope Foundation, whether you could tell us more about its mission, how did it start, and what work does the foundation do and how, in terms of its scope, for instance, or maybe a structure. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenka, and thank you, 𝗍𝗲𝗃. First of all, I'm very happy to be joining this conversation today and to talk about mushrooms, which is something very close to my heart, and to respond to the question about the Future of Hope. How did the Future of Hope start, and what does the Future of Hope Foundation do? The Future of Hope Foundation started in 2013. And this was actually building from the fact that I grew up as a young orphan, and I learned at a very young age to take care of my food and all the basics that I require. And I had to do that to take care of my younger brother and my grandmother. As a result of that, I found it very, very difficult to put food on the table, to the extent that when I was a young girl of 9, I came out of school to focus full-time on finding food. When I was 10, those around me who could actually help me offered to marry me off, because it was the only way I would be able to get food on the table. But also it was my license out of the village where I grew up into a space where I can be able to start thinking about finding a job. And the job I could find at that time, because I had simply done 5 grades of primary level education, it is the same kind of work I was doing in my village would be the job that I would be able to find. After I escaped that arranged marriage, I discovered mushrooms. I'm just going to share my screen and show you 2 pictures of me at that time, so you can sort of paint a picture of where this is all coming from. So if that is okay, I'm going to try and share that. Okay. Is this showing now?
Yeah, it is. Thanks.
So right here, this is Chido in the village. At this point in my life, my daily work was digging in people's gardens, cleaning their yards. And I also tended to a small field that belonged to my grandmother. In that field, I farmed what a girl my age could do at the time. And at the end of each farming season, I had more waste than I had food. So to have escaped a marriage arranged when I was 10, I refused because I wanted to stay with my grandmother. At 11, this is me at about 13, 14, but I discovered mushrooms when I was just 11 years old. What happened is we got an invitation from Africa University, which is in Zimbabwe, where there had been scientists working together, Zimbabwean scientists, also from Serbia, and I think the other scientists were from Zambia and Tanzania, something so. And they'd done some work together and learned to farm mushrooms, even traveled to China and brought some Chinese experts to Zimbabwe to learn about mushrooms. After that, a very special woman for whom I am very grateful, together with Ivanka from Serbia and the Zeri Foundation. Zeri is founded by a certain 𝗠𝗆𝗀, and Zeri stands for Zero Emissions Researchers and Initiatives. And they had worked together to facilitate this education for the scientists. So when they had done all the work that they had to do, there was some money left, and together they agreed the knowledge that we have is not for academia. The knowledge that we have has to go to girls like that Chido in the picture. And this is how I end up here. But as a young girl who was tending to a field and getting more waste than food at the end of each farming season, you can imagine my fascination with discovering mushrooms at the age of 11. In a small room, I was able to grow mushrooms which were growing on agro biomass, and I could sell mushrooms and get some money. I could eat the mushrooms, but suddenly the waste that used to just be waste became something so important for me. And I remember in the very beginning, I used to express it as realizing that waste could be converted into something valuable also helped to strengthen my belief in that, regardless of what I went through as a child, I can still turn my life around. I can still make something of myself. And so fast forward, when I was 12, I had to go to the university to work and grow mushrooms at the university, because in the village, you only can do what you can do there under the program that we were part of. I spent 3.5 years at Africa University working and learning in the laboratory, growing mushrooms and selling them. When I was 16, I went back to school, and I spent 4 years in school, in high school. After finishing my matric, I found myself asking, this thing that I'm doing of just waking up and going to school every day, is really what I want to do? And I felt that I had learned something so valuable, and I was good at it. I was happy doing it. And I wanted to take mushroom farming to the people who also need it the most. And in that thinking, I was thinking, if I could help saving a girl just like me to not be married as a young girl of 10, to have food on their table and be able to control their life, their freedom, that would make me so much happier. So I was 20, and I said, I don't want to go to school anymore. I want to start sharing about mushroom farming. I want to simplify the art of mushroom cultivation so it can go to different places. I was lucky to have people who supported this thinking. I said, I want to learn, but I think I can also learn out of school. And then through my work, I can learn a lot of things. So I started traveling around the world. And the very first place where I went actually with mushrooms was to Colombia. I went to Colombia to learn from a certain Ivanka, another woman in the mushroom world. And following that, I traveled to India. And I must highlight that in India, one of the very impressive things was that after I taught the women there, they said, farming mushrooms is easier than tending to a veggie garden. And that for me was very remarkable, because I realized that I was able to deliver this information in a way that women who are in the same situation or worse than I was actually think this is better than tending to a veggie garden. And so I wanted to do more of that. So I've done some work in Tanzania, in Cameroon, in Congo, in different places, including teaching young entrepreneurs to grow mushrooms on coffee, starting in the US and expanding it to Europe. But something was for me missing, because each time I went to these projects, it was on request from somebody. So if you look, for example, when I went to Ghana, it was on request of UNDP. When I went to India, it was on request of development alternatives in India. And they did the project to the extent where they felt like, okay, they have done what they have to do. And I felt I was always then afterwards disconnected to these groups of women. At the same time, I knew that this work we do with communities that need the most is about resilience building. To build resilience, you don't just do it once. You don't just help people through 2-3 production cycles. It has to be done over a period of time. And so I decided to create the Future of Hope, to create an organization actually that responded to that. But before all these travels, when I was 19, I'd written a book telling the story of my life as part of my healing process. And the title of that book was The Future of Hope. So here's this experience that I had. Here is this book. I was around 23. I'd written the book when I was 19. And I was asking myself, with all this that I have done, and the move I've made from the time when I wrote the book to where I am today, what is the future of hope? How can I start writing a new story? And I was thinking, do I write a new book explaining the future of hope? Or do I use the experience that I have now, and including some of the things that I didn't like about how I implemented my work in the places where I was invited? So I decided to create the Future of Hope Foundation to model that which I believe is the future of hope, working with women and girls and solving the most pressing problems and building on the thing that I had the most experience with. And so if you ask me, what does the Future of Hope do? The Future of Hope, the very first thing that we seek to address in the communities where we work is just the provision of the very basic needs. Because as a woman, I went through it. When I did not control my food, when I didn't have money for myself, I could have been sold to a husband, just like that, without thinking. And I decided I want to make it my life mission to make sure that food does not have to be the reason why a woman loses their freedom. And so in our work, the first thing is to address provision of basic needs and to build it around what is locally available. And this we do with our flagship project, which is mushroom farming. And we've made a system, which is a mouthful, where we call it the mushroom-based integrated food production system, where tapping into the abundant agrobiomass, we grow mushrooms. In 3 to 4 weeks, we have a fruit that is a mushroom. We can eat mushrooms as a culture in Zimbabwe. I grew up foraging for mushrooms with my grandmother, who was over 100 years old. And because of that, we actually do have a tradition. So mushrooms are relevant as a food in my culture. Mushrooms are relevant as a food in a lot of the places where I have worked. So mushrooms for food, but also mushrooms for nutrition and mushrooms for income, because we saw that from my experiences, if you don't want to eat the mushrooms, you can sell them. There's always somebody who likes to eat them. But the best thing is that the agrobiomass that would normally be burned is now being converted into a value that people can benefit from in any way that they choose. So the Future of Hope seeks to create enablers of people and communities, specifically women and girls, to take care of their basic needs using what is locally available. And from there, they can develop. With a full stomach, one can learn. With food on the table, one can be free to choose what they want with their lives. And who knows? Maybe one also can become the next girl who helps other girls.
Thanks so much for that really interesting introduction to the foundation and taking us through your story. And there's lots of things I think we'll want to pick up on. I'm really interested in food and freedom and the kind of relationship building that the foundation allows you to do, but maybe and storytelling. But maybe to start with, we could pick up where we ended on the mushroom-based integrated food production system. And do you have any examples of the places where you've done this work and the kinds of what kinds of waste products are you working with in the projects that you've done? I know I saw that you've worked with cotton and coffee, and this is something really new to me, for example. So I'd love to hear a bit more about its role in agriculture and how you and where this process came from even.
So we've worked, yes, with coffee, and for coffee specifically, we've been collecting coffee from cafes. That's what we did in the developed part of the world where they are processing coffee, and we converted that into mushrooms in urban areas and industry areas where they are doing the processing. Yes, we've also used coffee, but again, because of our emphasis on what is locally available in Zimbabwe, where the bulk of our work is now based and where we are developing it to take it out into different places, we've worked with all kinds of things. The staple food in Zimbabwe is based on corn, maize. And then we also have a variety of small grains. There's also the cultivation of wheat and other grains that are sort of international. And from all those, from maize, we use the maize stalks, we use the leaves, we use the cobs. And in any community, we tap into what is locally available. As an example, I can give you an example of my own place where I live in Zimbabwe. It's about 27 kilometers out of the city of Harare. And next door to me, when I just arrived in this place, was a factory that is processing one of the currently hyped superfoods, which is the baobab powder. They were collecting baobab fruits from different places around Zimbabwe and processing them next door to me. So when I arrived in this place, it was not really farming season. So I had to look around me to say, even though I don't see any fields with anything right now, what is available right now that I can use? And we found ourselves tapping into this waste from baobab. Before you get your superfood baobab powder, it's a whole fruit, which can be as big as my hand or smaller or a bit bigger. And they crush it open, and there's a whole shell and a lot of fibers inside of that shell. And nobody had grown mushrooms in those before, but we found piles and piles of this material, and we tapped into that, and we used that to grow mushrooms. But not only to grow mushrooms, we also used it as a base for making spawn in the local, in our small laboratory, because the mushroom spawn is something that was difficult for us to come by at that point in that area. The role of mushrooms, the role of the mushroom IFPS in agriculture for me is, first of all, when you look at the numbers of saying per hectare of these popular agro produce that we consume on a daily basis, in our case, corn, a hectare of corn at the end of the farming season, it is estimated that on average, only 11% is actual food, and about 89% is put to waste. So the role of this mushroom farming in agriculture, first of all, is to tap into this abundant waste and turn that into food. Because normally what is happening to this waste? Well, for people with cattle, they feed it to cattle. But until you can eat from a cow, it takes a long time. And for people without cattle, they normally convert this into compost. to convert corn cobs into compost, to convert corn stalks into compost, does not take anything less than 6 months. But at the end of those 6 months, if you do it right, and in 6 months you have a compost, you can't put the compost on the plate and eat it. You first have to put that compost on the soil. You need lots and lots of water before you can actually grow something from that compost that you can eat. Now, compost will take 6 months, but mushrooms, 3 to 4 weeks, you are harvesting a mushroom. And after the first harvest, you can expect 3, 4, or 5 other harvests from that same material that you've processed. As you are harvesting these 3 to 6 different times from that one batch, the mushroom mycelium is breaking down this material into a material that you can use as a fertilizer. But it is not just the process of making compost, because a cycle of mushroom production is 3 to 4 months, depending on where you are. So in less time, about 50% of the time that you would take to make a traditional compost out of the corn stalks, you can harvest mushrooms and eat them, or harvest mushrooms and sell them, and you also have a compost. And this is why we didn't mind calling this mouthful the integrated food production system that is based on mushrooms, because we are saying mushrooms as a decomposer are doing the work to quickly make available the compost from the corn stalks, while in the process giving us food and money. And once you have a compost rich with mycelium, which is the seed of the mushroom, and you put that in the soil, this is not just compost. This is a whole live organism you're placing back in the soil that will get there, continue breaking the biomass that you put in the soil. But there are a lot of soil life that are feeding also from these mushrooms. A good example is that you don't even need to understand this by looking at a microscope. You put a bag of spent mushroom substrate in the soil. You put some water. You wait a couple of weeks. You open that. There are already earthworms feeding from there. And by bringing back earthworms, when you understand earthworms, you see that as they are eating, the urine that they pass, that in itself is a fertilizer so rich that with the situation of our soils today, where the topsoils are depleted, conventional agriculture is forever emphasizing the use of chemicals to kill weeds, chemicals to make the plants grow, chemicals. At the end of the day, there's a limited amount of biomass in the soil that is adequate to keep replenishing the topsoils, to keep sustaining the life forms in the soil, because soil is not just soil. They are living things, some as big as the earthworms, some much smaller that we can't even see them with our naked eyes. But all of those working together, including just enzymes that are part and parcel of the soil, which if we only depend on chemical fertilizers, those things we are washing them away, we are killing them, we are damaging them. As a result, we destroy the natural diversity of soils and ending up with soils that don't produce much. And for me, when I think about food systems in general, this aspect of mushrooms being able to rejuvenate soils is far, far more important than just mushrooms as a food. Because once we can rejuvenate the soils, we can grow more of the corn if that is what we like. By growing more of the corn, we produce more waste, and we can, even if we don't want to use mushrooms for food, just to inoculate that waste with mushrooms and allow it to decompose on the land, we can rebuild food systems just by doing that. And so for me, mushrooms are much more than just food in the form of mushrooms, but can play an important role on healing our topsoils, healing the soil and the life in it. There's also an aspect that is coming because of climate change. And this is that our water tables are going lower and lower. And because of that, with naked soils, when it rains, water just goes far away and very fast. With mushroom compost, because the mycelium is about 99% water. So the mycelium can hold the water in the soil closer to the surface where we farm, if we use that as, and this is not something that I had to go into a laboratory to understand. My own farm is my laboratory, where I bury the mushroom spent substrate. I look and observe it, and we are hoping that now we can actually be able to study this and publish this. But real life experience are that from my small plot of 1.5 hectares, which is my home, which is my mushroom farm, and a bit of space where I grow my chickens, a bit of space where I start to raise my goats, which are eating from whatever we're producing locally. You can do much, much more. I had a picture right here that I was going to show you of the before and after of my farm when I was arriving there. This here is how it looked. You grow food because there were not enough weeds, because they would put the weed killer, and everything is made to disappear, because then you have a clean garden like that. And since I've been there, we started putting the mycelium in the soil. And as you can see, this thing here is a bean seed that is germinating. And around its roots, it's covered with the mycelium like this. And there is the bean growing, and the bean is actually looking whitish. If you look at the bottom here, it's covered in mycelium, but this bean is thriving. And this kind of bean, being a legume, it's also a nitrogen fixer. It is not in conflict with the mushroom. They are growing well together. And I don't think there is any better way of fixing soils than combining the mushroom with its possibility to hold water to support other life forms. And in this case, growing together with nitrogen fixers, then we can start a process really of healing the soils. This is a picture from the same place. The tunnel you see in the background is my mushroom house. And the same place, the soils look much better. And there's weeds in this clear piece at the beginning of this photo. You see that the weeds are growing, the food is growing, and it is not a question of just having the plant that we grew without food. We don't use artificial fertilizers, but this is a crop of peas. It's thriving. At the end of the day, we harvest mushrooms, we harvest greens from our garden, and we can bring that to the market. So promoting diversity in the form of food, promoting diversity in terms of life forms that support our food systems is the role of mushrooms in agriculture, if you ask me. Actually, it's not agriculture, it's food systems as a whole.
Thank you so much, Chido. This is really amazing. So you already told us, I really see this future of hope in so many layers, like a kind of like an emancipatory thing, what you were telling us, the story, how mushrooms saved you from the marriage when you were 10 years old, but also as a healer of soil, which is another aspect and completely different level of mushrooms are able to do. And I wanted to ask you one little question about, so in Czech Republic, it's also very popular to collect mushrooms, like as you said in Zimbabwe, but we don't have much experience with growing mushrooms. That's a very new thing in Czech. And I know that many people are also trying to have their little plot, or not even a mushroom house, people just have a little jar at home. And I was wondering whether you could maybe give us some kind of tips as an expert on what kind of mushroom would you grow? If I was a completely newcomer, which type of mushroom and what would be the things are, because I also heard from people that it's not very easy to grow mushrooms and a lot of times you fail. What would be the things to look after?
So the first thing would be for you to decide. You want to become a mushroom farmer. At what level? Because today, there are so many possibilities that exist. One of the possibilities is that you can get what is called a ready-to-grow kit. There are many people engaging in mushroom farming who produce kits for sale. And this is also something that we are working to promote in Zimbabwe because of water shortages and the like. But if you want to start gathering agrobiomass in your own community and converting that into mushrooms, then I would recommend the very first mushroom to start with, which we find to be the easiest, and also it's the one we are promoting the most in Zimbabwe, is the oyster mushrooms. The oyster mushroom grows on almost anything that has got some amount of lignocellulose in it, and the temperature control requirements are not as sensitive as you would have with button. And I think with this in mind, if you're growing button mushrooms, you have to control the temperatures quite a lot, and a change in temperature can make you lose the whole crop. But with oyster mushrooms, here's an example of a mushroom house we've built in a village. That flexibility of oyster mushrooms is something that makes it for us interesting to grow oyster mushrooms. The environment in terms of how sterile it is, it's not so fussy. Whereas button, you have to make a compost. The process of making a compost, if you get that wrong, letting it overheat or it does not heat up enough, that can make you lose the whole crop. Whereas with oyster mushrooms, the biomass, the way you take it from the fields with a little bit of treatment, even just with a bit of lime to control the pH, or depending on the state of the material, you can just pasteurize it. And then you mix it with the mushroom spawn, put it in incubation, which is a dark room, and you can grow your mushrooms. So oyster mushrooms are very flexible. And oyster mushrooms, in my native language, because they grow on tree logs, they are called 𝗤𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 is mushroom, danda is the wood, the logs on which the mushrooms grow. So a trunk, danda is a trunk, 𝗤𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. And so here's an example. Here's an example in the picture of a mushroom that we're using in the urban areas. And this is an example of how communities can work. Outside, they can wash the biomass, mix it up, and put inside their structure. This is a little plastic house that we make for people who can't build, but if they have big shady trees in their property, we make this. This is a beautiful avocado tree from my place. And so if you have a shady tree, you can just do a plastic mushroom house, and with oyster and its flexibility, you can get away with this. This is also a tin house. We designed this for communities where we work, where plastic houses will not be acceptable or won't last long because conflict or other challenges that arise with plastic. We made this tin house. You put this under a shade, and you put sand on the floor to keep it wet. You put straw bales on the roof, and you're good to go. You can grow your mushrooms. And this is actually how it looks inside of the tin house. These are the bags that we make, the blocks that we make. We put all the biomass we are using for the production in. We put the mushroom seed. Everything grows and become white, hanging like that. You start spraying. There's no need for a big farm to grow mushrooms. And this is in a village how they approach this. So it's not like you have to go it in one way. So oyster mushrooms have got this flexibility. Here is another setup. So because our goal is to make sure that everybody is able to do this, we've built in this flexibility that people can work with what they have. And this is a different setup. This is more the expensive setup, where you see we have a special device for the ventilation, drainage, and everything. This is actually a project that we're implementing now in Zimbabwe for Nestle, at the Nestle factory in Zimbabwe, where we collect coffee grounds and we turn them into mushrooms at the Nestle factory as a way of closing the loop in their production. So you can do this at different levels, and that flexibility is why oyster mushrooms 𝗏𝗏𝗏 is our favorite.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, 𝗏𝗏𝗏. In Czech, it's called 𝗧𝗲 𝗚ścičná.
𝗧𝗲 𝗚ścičná.
Yes, well done. Well done. Yeah, and I would just follow up on that question. So as I said, we're not so used to growing mushrooms in Czech Republic, and this is really valuable. And I'm sure that all of our, all people who are listening to us are now, taking notes and thinking about their own cupboards and cellars and tents to be in the garden to grow mushrooms. But first thing, I would like to encourage people, so you can already put your questions in the chat if you have any. But my next question, I would want to ask you about your experience with collecting mushrooms. So as I told you when we were preparing for our talk, in Czech culture, that's a really big thing, that we are all familiar with mushrooms, and usually we do it in with our grandparents, like you said, or you did it with your grandmother. So everyone has a kind of like a, almost like a, also like an affective or emotional and nostalgic relationship to mushrooms. So I was wondering whether you could maybe share more experience with that, or some memories you have from childhood, how people collected mushrooms, and maybe also what type of mushrooms grow there, because in Eastern Europe it's usually, if you know Boletus family,
yeah,
so that's what porcini, that's what we go for mostly. But I would be really excited to hear what type of mushrooms grow in Zimbabwe, and whether people know them and whether people collect them.
So there are a lot of different types of mushrooms that I used to forage for with my grandmother. And I actually have to tell you the story of my childhood experiences with my grandmother. So she was over 100 years old and she could not see clearly anymore. She had to use a walking stick. And of course, I also had to hold her hand on the other side. And what we normally did is I would walk with her into the forest, find a nice tree. She would sit under the tree. And as a little girl, I would run around and collect different kinds of mushrooms and put them in front of her. And she would break the mushroom and smell it. And she would tell me, this mushroom is edible and we can go and cook this at home today. This mushroom is inedible, but not poisonous. We can't eat it, you put it there. This mushroom is a little bit poisonous, but if we take it home, we cook it and dry it, and we eat it later in the year, then the poison is gone. And for somebody to have that knowledge, it took a long time. And to share it like my grandmother did also took a lot. So she used to tell stories as we were doing this foraging. Tell stories about when you go into a forest and you pick mushrooms, there's a certain language you can or can't use. So for example, when you find a mushroom and it looks a little rotten, you cannot say that, oh, this mushroom is rotten. Mushrooms don't rot. They just morph into a new version for the purpose for which they need to serve. And in my language, the way she expressed that was 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. Hoa does not rot, 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. Unodada. And I don't even know how to translate kudada in one word, but it's just, it's expressing that it morphs into a different phase, which is necessary for it to complete its life cycle. And so when you find that, first of all, normally when we say mushrooms are rotten, you see it when I talk. If it's something useless, I even have the hand to show that this is useless. So normally, because of that, in our culture, when we say this is rotten, there's an element of discarding it, undervaluing it. And my grandmother used to say, because mushrooms don't rot, and also because the forest is something much bigger and much more complex than us. There are gods in the forest. We cannot insult anything. So you don't do this useless. Something is useless. It has no purpose. You can't even use that language, and you can't even express it like that because you're insulting the gods of the forest. So if you find a mushroom that is rotting, you leave it in its natural habitat. You don't move it and throw it there or not. You leave it there. That is showing respect to the gods of the forest, used to say. When you find a place where there's lots of mushrooms, edible ones, and you harvest them, you're happy you found mushrooms. We have amanitas, we have chanterelles, and when you see a lot of them in one place, when you harvest, always make sure to leave one standing. This is gratitude to the gods of the forest. When you harvest the mushrooms, the ones that you harvest, you need to cut it in such a way that you leave the place where you harvest not exposed. You can do that by leaving a part of the stem in the ground, or you harvest and you move the organic material to cover the space where you've harvested. And if you ask my grandmother why, it's honoring the gods of the forest. Fast forward. When you go to the house with your mushrooms and you're cooking them, especially for the mushrooms with gills, when you are cooking them, you keep the pot open. Because if you close the pot, you close the forest, she used to say. And of course, as a little girl, this was something that this was also mythical. I could not understand. I never bumped into the god of the forest. I don't know anything about it. And she says, if you cook the mushrooms in the house, keep the pot open and keep the door open. I did not understand anything more than just that this is something we do out of respect to the gods of the forest, until I discovered mushrooms when I was 11 years old. And then when I was 12, I went into the laboratory and I was learning about spores and about how mushroom seed happens, that I started to understand this thing of the gods of the forest. It was just about maintaining that the mycelium stays in its natural habitat where it gets all the nutrients it requires to grow. And I think that was really my big connection with mushrooms, because it connected me in a way to my grandmother. Unfortunately, today, when I go back to the same forest, I don't find as many mushrooms as I used to find before. We used to go and harvest up to about 10 different types of mushrooms. And today, the main mushroom that is available that you can find with ease is just the amanita, the white one with a brown circle on the top, and it's slimy when you cook it. We also had wild oyster mushrooms growing. That's how we have the name 𝗨𝗨. But today, when you go into the forest, a lot has been depleted because farming, because firewood, and of course, all these chemicals we use in the soil, when it rains, they are washed into the different parts of the forest as well, which causes depletion of this base of mycelium today. So it is unfortunate that because civilization, also young people don't spend as much time with their grandmothers learning, just like I did. Today, all the mushrooms that I know, all the wild mushrooms, including some version of bolets that we used to harvest and dry and eat later, all the ones that I know, I learned in that time with my grandmother. Since my grandmother was not there anymore around 2009, I haven't learned something new about wild mushrooms, and I don't see as many as I used to see when I was 7, when I was 9. And today I started a whole journey of looking for elders who know about mushrooms, who can go to certain areas where mushrooms are growing. And I recently found that there's an old man who's over 100 who keeps a book of a special forest where he harvested some type of termite mushroom, the giant one, the one that grows really high. And he kept a record each time he harvested this mushroom. And I'm still curious to go on a journey to find this man and to see if I can learn something from him. But otherwise, apart from these rare situations, a lot of young people, young families are not anymore that familiar with foraging for mushrooms. When you read about forage mushrooms, most of the times you're reading storylines like a family of 6 died because they ate poisonous mushrooms. And so for us, then the cultivated mushroom provides that possibility to carry on our culture of eating mushrooms in face of this new gap that was created by the fact that not enough of us learned from our grandmothers and can be able to carry that forward. And as part of the work of the Future of Hope and what we're doing now while we are building our laboratory, one of the things that we are really keen on is to see if we can find a way of using our laboratory to actually bring back some of these wild mushrooms, to identify areas in the country where they still exist and create a bank of spores for these mushrooms, a bank of mycelium for these mushrooms, and slowly work towards bringing them back into nature. I collaborate with an artist who's done a lot of work with chickens and traveling in different parts of the world and finding the original version of the chicken and crossing it with chickens as we know them today to try and preserve the gene pool. And in that same way, we think this work towards preserving the natural biodiversity, the natural wild mushrooms, some of them that you can't cultivate in a controlled environment, but at least you can culture the spores and bring them back and work around, you know, with the understanding we have of mushroom farming today. I strongly feel that there is a way we can start plowing back into nature and rebuilding this diversity of wild mushrooms. It is a bit sad for us that there's not enough of mushroom foraging, safe mushroom foraging going on today.
That's so interesting. I definitely want to pick up on some of these things around forms of learning. But first, we've got a question in the chat that relates to the projects that you spoke about that I'll read out from Jonas. I would like to ask, what is the nature of the relationship with Nestle? In Europe, they have a very bad reputation for denying access to drinkable water and worker exploitation.
Yes, I know that in some parts or in many parts, they have a bad reputation. But of course, we cannot deny the reality that in the past, a lot of the ways that businesses have been built was just on focusing on that which is our core business. And that is not a problem of Nestle alone. It is a problem of many businesses. However, when we engage from a place of building something new, we always have then to open up to learning together and to helping the learning process. Our experience with Nestle has not been that of exploitation, or as you might have experienced, or other people have experienced it. For us, it is clear the drive of Nestle and our drive in this case is in the same direction, where we are trying to correct things that have been going wrong. We build across all industries, we build systems that are against nature. And we are working hard to try and resuscitate this. If you just look at the story I just given you of saying wild mushrooms used to be there, we started applying fertilizers so that we can have more of the things that we like, more of the bread that we like every day for breakfast. And as a result, even though it may not be as confrontational as the Nestle story may have been presented in one specific area, a lot of the things, when you look at them today from a place of where we are in the world as a civilization today, there was a lot of harmful things, and we need to right those things. And how do we right them? Is it overnight? But it's this little efforts where we really mean what we're doing. And in this case, we're saying, yes, coffee, because we all like coffee. I'm sure all of us here had coffee in the morning, but how can we make this better? If we can follow through the waste, convert that into something valuable, and at the same time, it generates jobs for people who don't have jobs in a fair way. For us, we've been very delighted actually to work with Nestle, because it has brought something meaningful to our work that we wouldn't have realized otherwise. We had taught people to farm mushrooms in different parts of the world on coffee, but we had not been able to meaningfully realize something in Zimbabwe. And here we're able to do it. And not only are we doing it, but we're also able to model how this can be done at scale, and to allow other people to learn about this. So we've been very fortunate. We have a healthy relationship. It is not based on exploitation at all. It is a win-win situation for us, because we also don't pretend that the world is rosy. We face it as it is, and we know that this is a process. Writing some of the systematic things that are wrong in our world today is a process.
Thank you, Chido, for answering that question. And I think it's clear from how, or at least to me, from the story, how you're talking about your life and your journey, is that it's always, and mushrooms show it as well, that we are always situated in certain places, right? Situations, and they're very complex in terms of environmental challenges and political situations and other hardships. But we have another question which I would like to read in Q&A, and the question is related to the forest and the gods of the forest.
Mm-hmm.
Do the forest gods have names? And are the mythical stories around mushrooms and the forest alive or available anywhere?
So unfortunately, from the stories that I learned from my grandmother, these gods of the forest didn't have any names. And I think I haven't read any stories actually, and this is where I also keep telling my story with my grandmother. I'm a strong believer that we need to share more of these stories, and maybe we should start naming the gods of the forest, the mushroom god or something. But from my grandmother's stories, there were no names. But I would be curious if anyone has had any experiences where the gods of the forest had names. For my grandmother, for us, God is God. There's not this God and that God. There's just one God.
Yeah. I would maybe put a preposition. Maybe it could be goddesses, just to, you know.
That's true. That's
Yeah.
true. You know, actually, in that same forest where we foraged for mushrooms in my village, there was actually a little mountain, and in the mountain there were caves, 2 of them, but very big. And the story goes that in those caves lived 3 snakes, pythons, big ones. So, and at the end of every good farming season, the women of the village would go to that cave and make their offerings, seeds in clay pots, and put there. It was actually the mountain for the women of the village. And when there's a bad year, the women would also go to make a ceremony in that mountain and get those grains out so they can plant in anticipation of a good yield. So I would like to think, since that mountain was right there in the middle of this forest where I foraged for mushrooms with my grandmother, I can say that these were goddesses in this case, although it was not explicitly expressed like that. But building from that story, I think it was goddesses.
Thanks so much. So one of the questions that we've been asking everyone is, if you were reborn as a mushroom, what mushroom would you be? So,
oh, for me, if I was reborn as a mushroom, I would be this giant termite mushroom. And this is actually, they're the small termite mushrooms that you find everywhere. But there's one that grows very big, which can have a stem of even up to about 0.5 meter or a bit more, and a cap so big. And those ones are rare to find. And actually, when I was a child, around 4 or 5 years, I found them. And so and so if I would be reborn as a mushroom, I would be that. So because we attach a lot of importance to that mushroom and also finding it. And it is actually the same mushroom that this old man I told you, I heard he was recording each time he gets those mushrooms, because they don't come as often as other normal mushrooms. And so when you find those, the elders say you are a very lucky person, you will prosper in everything that you do in your life, and you will have a long life. So it's a good omen to find those mushrooms. In a forest where it's usually an anthill where you find those is actually very well respected. So I would come back as that mushroom, but I would try to appear in as many places as possible so that the forest, the nature can be preserved.
Yay!
that's a great answer.
Thank you so much, and what an amazing mushroom to be. Maybe I'll add one more question to that, and maybe we can close up our conversation if there are no more questions from the audience. Because this how we asked that question and how you answered it, this is a particular type of story, right? And you were also telling us the story about your hardship and about your difficult life and how you're fighting in that life. And you also told us about your book, which is also a story, I would say. So it seems that stories are very important to what you do, or they are part of all that process. And maybe the future of hope needs to have a shape of story. I don't know. And I was just wondering whether maybe you could develop on that. What stories mean for you when others tell stories, when people share stories, and when people connect through stories?
Stories are, for me, the most important way to build connection. And if there's one thing that we need in the world today, is better connections, where we build connections not on the basis of status, but on the basis of these things that make us human, that we are able to share and to laugh about, the very little things that help us realize the essence of life and community. And I actually think that when I look at where does my ability to tell stories start, it's also from my grandmother. And because of that, my grandmother today is like my very first mom, because I was able to build that connection with her from the stories and all the things we did together. And almost in everything that we did, me and my grandmother, a new story would emerge. And some of them still today, which have nothing to do with mushrooms, but also my very first lesson of hope was actually through the stories that my grandmother used to tell, of the things to come, of the things past. And so I think storytelling breaks the walls that sometimes stop us from learning from each other as much as we should. We hear a lot today that there's more effort to break silos, to make more communication between different disciplines and all this. And I think the magical ingredient is storytelling. And it's of course, obviously, in this case, no surprise that even in the future of hope, today, and in the last couple of months, actually, I've been talking to my team and saying, one of the things that I like very much is that we've been able to grow quite quickly for a young organization in Zimbabwe, but I feel that we lost that magic of storytelling. We were always sitting in circles with young girls when they come for trainings and sharing stories. And I find that beneficiaries of the Future of Hope that we interacted with, where we sat in a circle and we shared stories, and the ones where we got a caseload of people to work with, and we worked with them, just the technical things, it's a very different outcome altogether. There's something that grows from sharing stories. There's some, it's this aspect of feeling some sense of relatability to the person who's teaching you, feeling that you can, this is a human and I am human too. And that kind of foundation that is created by storytelling, I think is also something very important that can help us also even solve some of our major problems in the world today, including COVID. If we could relate to each other from the stories we tell, even the discussion around Green Pass would be different. The discussions around vaccination or not would be different. There would be a kind of relationship that's not just the technicality of things or just me enjoying my rights for me, enjoying my freedom for me. It would be something more.
I think that's so interesting, and I'm really struck by how storytelling's this way of healing and transforming, but also you have to tell stories, it needs a listener, and that listening is can be a really radical and transformative act, especially
Yes.
done in a community and with other people.
I totally agree with you.
So we have one more question, and maybe this could be our last question, a question from audience, and then we will just close our conversation. Someone anonymous person says, it's amazing how you came up to your knowledge and the ethics around it. How do you share your knowledge with other farmers? Is it some kind of school system? How people find you?
So the way we share our stories with other farmers is, of course, with other farmers, with people in general, is first by accepting having this conversation. I think by having this conversation, I've opened up to you to different parts of how we can interact going forward. And for farmers in Zimbabwe, we have a team of trainers who go into the different communities where we work to teach. And sometimes we also bring people together into our space. As I mentioned earlier, I have my own home, which is a little farm. And sometimes, especially when we are teaching teachers, we like to spend time with them and to build this connection. And so normally we bring them to a central place. But on the long term, we're actually thinking of building some form of a learning center, a school where people can actually learn from, the mix of life in different ways. Again, going back to that friend of mine I mentioned who's crossbreeding chickens, it's an artist who's working on different aspects of engaging with communities. And we are coming together to work on a concept that combines our different works and try to reach more people with this way of art to help people to start thinking in a different way. So we hope that one day actually will be a school or schools in different places where people can go and learn. But today, you find us through these kinds of connections. We are on Facebook, although not as active, but we are in the process of fixing that. We do have a website, and that will be also shared along with this conversation, where you can see about some of the work that we are doing. And we hope to get better at sharing this using social media. But of course, when you talk too much like I do, how can you put that in a small social media post?
Brilliant. Yeah. So I think if people look at the Future of Hope Foundation online, there's a lot of information, and Chido's done some really interesting talks that are also online if you want to find out more about the foundation and your work.
Yeah. And also on that aspect of how you can find us, on our website also is a link to a shop where we are selling produce from our different communities, where we would very much appreciate, for those of you who are keen on tasting mushrooms in different ways, you're welcome to go on Amazon and buy from some of our products, which are a product of a collaboration between us and 𝗘𝗃.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks, Chido, for telling us about this last bit. And maybe we can close our conversation with this information. And I would really want to thank you very, very much, Chido, for joining us today and teaching us and sharing your knowledge about mushrooms and mushroom growing and all this wisdom and your projects you're involved in. So that was very wonderful. And thank you very much. And I'm handing over to 𝗟𝗲𝗀𝗃, who is going to tell us what we are doing next time.
So next Wednesday, we're going to be in conversation with 𝗘𝗹𝘀𝗽𝗲, who's a British artist who's done a really interesting project called the Neon Hieroglyph, looking at psychedelic feminism and ergot fungus. So she's been doing a lot of research into that. So we'll be speaking to her.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for watching us today.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Brilliant. Thanks so